Hi, I'm Amy Taylor, and along with Brandon Thomas and Jenna Taylor, we're going to be presenting a mock session of the Beck Depression Inventory 2, also known as the BDI-2. This was designed as a tool to measure severity of depression in adolescent or adult clients, anyone ages 13 or up. It's not used to diagnose depression by itself. It's designed to measure severity of the symptoms and along with a clinical interview that can be used to make a diagnosis. Certain items related to depression, such as suicidality or changes in appetite or sleep, are assessed on this inventory, and that can be very helpful for clinicians to get that information. It's really important to note that only psychologists are able to administer or score this assessment, but as counselors, we will interact on interdisciplinary teams, and we may have clients who are referred from or to a psychologist for this assessment, so we need to know about it. Typically, it's either self-administered or orally administered by the examiner. There's a computer version and a pen and paper version. What's really nice is that it's a short assessment. It only has 21 items and takes about 5 or 10 minutes typically. If a client has severe depression or obsessions, they may take a little bit longer, but typically it's 5 to 10 minutes. The setting for our mock session is individual assessment in a private office. The client has been referred by his regular counselor for an assessment of his depression. And as you can see, comfort and confidentiality are going to be really important. It's a vulnerable time for a client when they come in for an assessment. It also needs to be well lit and quiet so that the client can focus on the assessment. The examiner will administer the BDI-2, explain the results to the client, and then later share them with his regular counselor. In our scenario, the release of information forms have already been signed and confidentiality will be discussed. The client in this mock session is an African American young adult male who's reported to his regular counselor that he feels depressed at certain times. The examiner is a Caucasian young adult female who recently completed graduate training and licensure in psychology, and she's had some multicultural training, which she'll be keeping in mind. Prior to meeting with the client, she inquired about his reading and comprehension level to see if the self-assessment or the oral administration would be more appropriate. She's also reviewed the norming data and some empirical research on using the tool with African American clients, and she'll keep the standards for multicultural assessment in mind. She'll also keep in mind that there is a gender difference between herself and her client. So let's watch as she greets the client, begins building initial rapport, and reviews confidentiality. Pay attention to her body language and how she leans forward, using verbal and nonverbal encouragers to help the client feel safe.
Hi Brandon, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Great, I'm glad to hear that. And I want to, first off, thank you for coming in today and taking your time to come meet with me. Just as a reminder before we get started that we have gone through the informed consent and the confidentiality, and just to remind you that the times when confidentiality might not apply is when there is abuse of a child or elder. You might be harmful to yourself or to others, or if it's been court ordered. Do you have any questions or anything before we go ahead and get started with the assessment?
No.
All right, great. And so I do.
As you see, building rapport at the beginning of the assessment process can be communicated through warmth and empathy. The examiner has used reflection and her tone of voice to make the client feel comfortable, and he had no questions for her about confidentiality. It is ethically and legally required that she review the details of confidentiality so that he could truly give informed consent. Although this examiner in our case is a psychologist and not a counselor, we'll refer to the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics. In Section A, Informed Consent, it's mandated that clients must be given adequate information about counseling or assessment, and that the counselor must be culturally and developmentally sensitive in providing the information. Also in Section B, Confidentiality and Privacy, it's explained that counselors must be culturally competent when talking about confidentiality. They must explain its limits and get written permission before sharing results of an assessment with any third party. Additionally, Section E, Evaluation, Assessment, and Interpretation, mandates that informed consent must be received prior to the assessment. And as you see, our examiner has done that. She honored informed consent by not just handing the client a form and telling him to sign it. She actually talked things through and made sure that he understood. Next, let's watch as she explores the client's perceptions of his depression and explains a bit more about the assessment.
So, as you know, your counselor, Mike, referred you to me to complete this assessment. I understand that you've reported feeling depressed at times in your sessions with him, and this assessment is just going to help you, Mike, and myself better understand those times when you are feeling depressed so that we can do our best at helping you. Before we get started, do you have any questions with the assessment or what we'll do with the results of it?
Outside of you and Mike, will anybody else have access?
Nobody, everything is completely confidential, so nobody will have access unless those three statements earlier occur where there would be concern for abuse of a child or elder, harming of yourself or others, or if it was court ordered. But if those things do not occur, then all of it will be kept between the three of us.
Okay.
Great. As you see, she spoke with the client, again, specifically about the referral from his counselor, highlighting confidentiality and the fact that a release of information has been signed. Remember that it would be unethical to share information about this assessment with any third party, even his own counselor, if the release of information was not signed. Also remember the client can revoke permission to release information at any time. According to Sue and Sue in Counseling the Culturally Diverse, it's important to keep in mind that many African American clients prefer to work with clinicians who recognize that clients are experts on themselves and who form an egalitarian relationship and go beyond service level impressions. Our examiner keeps this in mind as she works with this client, remembering to build a framework of equality and to let the client express whatever he wants to express about his symptoms if he wants to share that. Being culturally sensitive also involves being aware of kinesics or communication styles. Sue and Sue highlighted that some styles of communication may lead to misinterpretation in a multicultural setting. Some African American clients display less eye contact and less nodding during conversation. So our examiner keeps this in mind, that there is a cultural difference in communication styles, perhaps, and she is careful not to mischaracterize her client's communication according to any internal biases. Let's watch as they move on to the assessment themselves. As I stated earlier, there are two ways to complete the assessment. If the client can easily read and understand written English, then self-administration is appropriate. Let's go ahead and watch the examiner giving the assessment using self-administration first.
So Mike, so Brandon, for this assessment, you are going to read the directions and the items independently, and you will choose the answer that best describes how you have been feeling over the last 2 weeks, including today. There are 21 items to answer, and it should take you about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. Once you're done, let me know, and we'll review the results together.
Okay.
All right.
As you see, self-administration consists of the client independently reading the directions and responding to each of the 21 items, either online or with a pen and paper. Based on how the client's been feeling for the past 2 weeks, including today, they choose and circle one of their response items for each statement. If more than one response applies and they ask the counselor or the examiner, the client's encouraged to choose the higher response number. It can be helpful to note that items numbers 16 and 18 can be confusing for some clients because they inquire about sleep and appetite, and there seem to be more response options, so that can be confusing for clients. When the client finishes up, they will not self-score their assessment. Rather, the examiner will total their responses and attend to scoring. When reviewing the results, also it's important to take note of items 2 and 9 because they tap into suicidal thoughts and wishes and pessimism. There's a higher risk of suicidal ideation with depression, so it's very important that the examiner assesses items 2 and 9 and has referrals, resources, and suicide interventions ready in case the client expresses suicidal ideation. Next, we're going to watch the examiner giving the same assessment via the oral administration, which is appropriate for clients who cannot read or understand written English or who have a physical disability that prevents them from being able to do that. With this method, the client will tell the examiner what number item they agree with, and the examiner is going to confirm it by rereading the statement that corresponds with that number. If during the oral administration the client begins to read ahead on their copy, which they will be given to read along with, and they start answering questions independently, the examiner can allow them to go ahead and take over and do self-administration. Finally, it's important that the examiner encourages self-reflection if the client answers all the questions with the same response. Depression can be associated with black and white thinking, so if a client chooses the same response to each of the 21 items, the examiner can ask them to do some more reflection and reconsider some of their answers. Let's watch.
So Brandon, this is a questionnaire. On the questionnaire are groups of statements. I will read a group of statements, then I would like you to pick out one statement in each group that best describes the way you have been feeling during the past 2 weeks, including today. You'll have a copy to follow along with me as we go through the assessment. So that will be your copy, and I will record your answers on this version. Number 1, sadness. 0, I do not feel sad. 1, I feel sad much of the time. 2, I am sad all of the time. 3, I am so sad or unhappy that I can't stand it.
1.
I feel sad much of the time?
Yes.
Okay. 2, pessimism. 0, I am not discouraged about my future. 1, I feel more discouraged about my future than I used to be. 2, I do not expect things to work out for me. 3, I feel my future is hopeless and will only get worse.
1.
I feel more discouraged about my future than I used to be.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the examiner will go through all of the 21 items with the client as you've just witnessed. Once the entire assessment has been completed, all 21 items have been answered, all of the scoring is completed by the examiner. The first step is for the examiner to make sure that all 21 items were answered. If anything was left off or left blank or not answered, the examiner should encourage the client to complete them. And again, if the same answer was given for each item, the examiner should encourage the client to reflect and have more diversity in their answers. To score it, the examiner just adds up the ratings, which could range from 0 to 3 for each item. 63 is the highest possible score. The possible scores are divided into 4 categories. If a client has 0 to 13 points on the scale, they're going to be labeled as having a minimal risk of depression. That's the lowest category of symptoms. 14 to 19 points is seen as having a mild risk. If a client scores 20 to 28, their depression risk is seen as moderate, and any score of 29 to 63 is a severe risk of depression. As mentioned earlier, it's really important to know items 2 and 9 because they tap into suicidal thoughts and wishes, and there can be a higher risk of suicidal ideation with depression. A suicidal ideation may not be overtly expressed, but that tendency can be seen in clients who stop eating and sleeping, so the examiner should also pay attention to items 16 and 18, which tap into changes in sleep and appetite. So let's watch now as the examiner scores the BDI-2 and then interprets the results with the client.
So Brandon, once again, I want to thank you, for taking your time and doing this assessment with me. I have had a chance to add up the different items that you answered, and you did have a total score of 24. And so I'm sure you're wondering what that means. And based off of the manual that we use for this assessment, these scores can fall into 4 different categories of your risk for depression. And so yours, with that score of 24, falls into the moderate category, which is the 3rd highest risk for depression out of those 4. So what this means is that I think that the recommendation referral that Mike had of you coming here was definitely something beneficial. We were able to gather a lot of information from this, and especially telling us what areas that your tendencies of depression might be impacting you the most. So with this, I will have a chance to sit and talk with Mike for us to review the next steps and what some goals should be for you going forward with counseling.
When interpreting results for a client, the Standards for Multicultural Assessment recommend that counselors should understand the norming groups, the technical information, benefits and limitations, and potential for bias. It's also very important to be aware of how oppression and stigma may have had an impact on the interpretation of the assessment results. In this mock session, our examiner is aware that the norming group for the BDI-2 was primarily Caucasian. However, she's also examined the research literature to inquire about how appropriate this tool was for an African American client. She found several studies indicating the tool does accurately measure depression in African American university students, in African American individuals who've attempted suicide, and African American primary care patients. She's also reviewed data that the BDI-2 is not racially biased. So she communicates her confidence in this tool and its ability to measure the symptoms of depression with this client. When she's explaining the results, she uses descriptive terms. She makes it clear that she's not diagnosing the client with depression, but that based on the results of this tool, he falls into that category. As appropriate, she would hone in on any section that had an especially high score, such as suicidal ideation, or if he indicated changes in sleep and appetite. She makes it really clear that these results are part of the diagnostic process and will not solely be used to make a diagnosis. Now let's watch as she summarizes the results again and wraps up the assessment session.
So as you know, we have gone through this assessment, and I will be in touch with Mike before you see him for your session next week. Something that I would really encourage you to do is think of some possible goals that you would like to accomplish in your counseling sessions with Mike. And then him and I will talk, and when you meet with him next week, the two of you will be able to create some really helpful goals to help you during this time.
Okay.
Great. So to end an assessment session, again, it's helpful to summarize the results with an emphasis on the most important points, along with a general outline of the next steps so the client knows what's going to be happening next. If the results had indicated suicidality, the examiner would have needed to do a thorough suicide risk assessment and then provide referrals or an intervention. But as you saw, she wrapped up with a concise summary to ensure that the client understood his results, and so he had an opportunity to ask any questions. This is appropriate if there has not been suicidality indicated. She showed respect, empathy, and warmth and thanked the client for his time. She outlined the details of how the results were going to be shared with his counselor, Mike, per the informed consent agreement. She also painted a picture of what the next session would be like. Going forward, to create goals based on this assessment, the examiner should collaborate with the client and his regular counselor, Mike. As you saw, she encouraged the client to start thinking about his goals ahead of time. For both the examiner and the counselor, it's important to remember the standards for multicultural assessment and how they recommend considering background, culture, and individual characteristics when designing and implementing interventions that are based on assessment results. Some things to be aware of include the fact that culture affects the manner in which a client's problems are experienced and defined. If the counselor had any indication that the depression symptoms or severity were culturally based due to racism, microaggressions, micro-insults, or any other cultural factor, she should be sure to communicate that to the client's counselor. And if she had any doubts about the results of the assessment being appropriate, she should communicate those as well. Section E9A of the Code of Ethics for the American Counseling Association says that in reporting assessments, if you have reservations due to circumstances or inappropriateness of the norms on the person being tested, that it's really important to make that clear. So the next steps to follow up from this session would be to communicate the results along with the examiner's own impressions to the counselor and have the meeting 1 week later to develop counseling goals specific to the client's depression. I hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching our mock session for the Beck Depression Inventory 2. I hope you've learned something new.